a very distinctive style of comedy that developed in Hollywood from like the mid 30s through the early 40s. Was this thing called screwball comedy. I'm not necessarily the best equipped to define that, but it would be films like His Girl Friday, or some people say the first one is Frank Capra's It Happened One Night, which is a film that I really like. It's often, but not always, characterized by like fast, snappy dialogue, sometimes like overlapping dialogue, absurd situations, and of course, a focus on romance. These aren't like romantic comedies in the exact sense that we understand it today, but it is sort of like an older form, an older way of doing it that is very specific to a time period.
Screwball, really does stand in the era of classic Hollywood. Screwball, along with kind of all the other major classic genres that we see coming out of classic Hollywood, so film noir, the Western, the musical, and you could maybe say a few others, but I'd say like those three plus Screwball really kind of stand as the pillars of classic Hollywood. These are the films that we remember the most, and there obviously are huge differences between these genres. What they all have in common, is the pleasure they offer, and the distinctive ways that they offer that pleasure. And so when I start to think about Screwball, and just it is one of the most sheerly pleasurable ways that you can experience a film. Screwball, from the height of Hollywood, from that kind of era of roughly 1934 to the early 1940s, which is that era that you were using the term earlier, comedies of remarriage, which is a term that was, I believe, was coined by Stanley Cavell, an American philosopher who was writing about different themes and similarities that he was seeing in these films in the late 70s and the early 80s. And he coined this term, the comedy of remarriage, to kind of define this period from roughly 1934 to around 1941, 1942, where there was this kind of explosion of Hollywood films about couples who are going through these tumultuous relationships. They divorce, and then the film is about them getting back together. Or it may also involve a couple that is engaged. They have a misunderstanding or a fight. They part, and then they come back together. So the whole thing is all about this kind of this parting and this coming back together. But with Screwball, like, it's just that you only have to watch a few minutes. You only have to watch a few minutes of a great Screwball film to be totally hooked.
Yeah.
And the film that I would always point people to, I think The Awful Truth is a great example of this. But if there's one film that I think anyone can sit down and they will instantly be hooked, it would be Howard Hawks's His Girl Friday, which is kind of, again, held up as one of those classic. It's one of the paragons of screwball Hollywood, especially for its fast talking. It's got a ridiculously sharp script full of, every single line is this like jewel of wit, and then it's all spoken at an incredibly blisteringly fast pace. So you just kind of...
Do you think that Cary Grant, since he stars in that as well, do you think he is the definitive Screwball hero?
I would say so. You could...
He's also in Bringing Up Baby, another of the
he's
most
also in George
examples
Cukor's Holiday, which is another film that I would hold up as like, top three Screwball. For me, but the top three of Screwball would be, they all have Cary Grant. It would be His Girl Friday, The Awful Truth, and Holiday. And those are all made within 4 years of each other. But there are other actors who show up in that as well. Clark Gable, of course, is one who is famous for It Happened One Night. It's really more actresses. There's more variety amongst actresses in the Screwball Hollywood tradition. And a lot of those great actresses of that period are the ones, they all have great Screwball roles. So you think of Jean Arthur, Katharine Hepburn,
Barbara Stanwyck,
and Rosalind Russell in His Girl Friday. The list kind of goes on and on. There was just such a deep bench of incredible actresses who kind of all got their time to shine within this genre. And going back to this sort of principle of what is the pleasure of Screwball, it's and I liken this in some ways to the Hollywood musical at its height. You know, when you're watching like Fred Astaire dance, you know, at the height of his powers, there is a true true poetry is happening. You know, not just by analogy, but like there is a poetic power that you experience. Not just from watching a master dance, but also the way in which the great filmmakers he worked with, especially someone like Vincente Minnelli, the way that they kind of approach his talent and capture that. And so there's a similar dynamic going on in Screwball with the great Screwball directors, the way that they knew how to handle. They're incredibly talented actors, and you know, to push and to pull and to hold back when necessary. And there are different styles that, you know, that can be discussed as to how they would help actors reach the performances that they ended up giving. But you see this, there's this true poetic experience happening at the highest moments of these films, moments when the sharpness of the dialogue, the visible joy, I would say, that you can see in the actors' performances. And I mean, Cary Grant is the classic kind of example of this. And by way of just talking about him quickly, I was reading an interview with Leo McCarey that McCarey did with the French journal Cahiers du Cinéma in 1965. And McCarey has this wonderful quote in there where he talks about how Grant had such a irrepressible sense of humor that he could never hide it. And that made him, of course, very ill-suited to deeply, you know, tragic or dramatic roles. But for comedy, you know, it's absolute gold. So part of what makes Grant such a fascinating actor to watch is that you can see his humor and his visible pleasure in the moment on screen. And it's this pleasure that's part of the performance itself. It's part of his pleasure as an actor, and it's also somehow he works it, I would argue, into the characters themselves. Like, these are characters, and you get this sense of a fully alive, rounded experience of human nature, and with all the complexities that come with that. It's electric. So what I would say is, like, Screwball at its height, like all great cinema, is electric, and its electricity is particularly tied to this marriage of dialogue, which, you know, can be very hard to get right in any genre or any kind of film, and performance. So it's a very actor driven kind of genre. It's a very writer driven genre, and particularly with regards to the words that are being spoken, not so much plot, though that does matter too. And I think you mentioned kind of like, as anyone who's has an interest in the breadth of what cinema as an art form can offer, you know, which allows you to look at artsier films or more art house, maybe like slower, more contemplative films, or more complex or intellectually driven films. You know, that's kind of the cliche of the cinephiles. They are interested in the higher or the slower. And Screwball is a kind of phenomenon that just puts that all to rest, because it's really, to me, it brings it back to cinephilia is about pleasure. It really is about experiencing the electricity of cinema, and that can happen in all sorts of ways, including something that seems as kind of familiar to us as just dialogue-driven comedy. You know, when it's done well or perfectly, there are few things more enjoyable in the modern age, I would say. And The Awful Truth is absolutely a perfect example of that dynamic in action. Sound film, like the development of motion pictures with sound. The Awful Truth, I think, is one of those films. We were talking about how Screwball as a genre really kind of emerges with It Happened One Night, you know, and one of the arguments that Stanley Cavell makes in his book Pursuits of Happiness is that Screwball really could not emerge before 1934, the year of It Happened One Night, because there needed to be a certain maturation period for motion pictures to really kind of, and for filmmakers to figure out what they're doing with sound. You know, sound film is introduced in 1927, 1928. And then you have this period where the studios especially are mining like all these plays that nobody cares about, because now everyone wants to hear dialogue. But things are very kind of stagey. They're very, that you lose the fluidity and the visual dexterity of silent cinema that had been developing up to that point. Everything becomes very, very kind of motionless because, you can't move the mics around very much. But by 1934, they'd figured out new ways of getting back into a more fluid and flexible way of filmmaking, which then opens up new possibilities for what we can do with sound as an artistic medium. And I think it's striking, that like Screwball definitely comes out of as a direct result of that. It's so based on dialogue and the interactions between people, especially men and women, and just all the stuff that happens within that. But the awful truth, and some of McCary's champions have talked about this, how his films are very silence matters a great deal in his films. And you see this with the great directors who made the transition from silent to sound. In my opinion, the best ones are the ones who truly, they really make space for silence as an interval, as something that is full of weight, is full of meaning.
Yeah.
And
that matters for comedic timing,
It matters for timing, but even more so, and I think we see this, the confidence that it takes for a director to trust that an actor of Cary Grant or Irene Dunn's caliber can just kind of breathe a certain way, and the mic, we'll pick that up, and we're hearing the sound of just like a slight breathing. There was a couple moments in this viewing where there's some gesture that Grant does, and it's just so subtle. I mean, you notice it because it's the only thing he's doing in that moment, but it's just that the confidence is there that we don't have to rely on words alone. We're using the whole, we're using every resource available to us. And this really wasn't possible, even a few years before this film was made.